I hope that the exam, the on-campus exam that you had on Tuesday went well. I don't know yet because, as I said in the announcement and the email blast that I sent out, I don't have them yet. They were sent out to me yesterday, so maybe outside chance that I get them on Saturday, more likely that I get them on Friday, and then at least I'll need a few days to get those graded. But as soon as I get them, I'll let you guys know. As soon as I have them graded, I'll also let you guys know so that you can see scores, and then I'll be sending them to you in your self-addressed stamped envelopes so that you can have them to review for the final and also to review comments and see how things went. So, in the meantime, looking forward, we've got a next exam on the horizon on November 13th. So this is after the Veterans Day weekend. It's on a Tuesday. And so this one will cover 3 chapters. So 1 chapter fewer than last time, but in this case, we are addressing 3 different body systems again. So we're going to be doing respiratory system, we're going to be doing immune system, combined a little bit with lymphatic, and then we're going to be doing the urinary system. So for those different systems, we'll find that there's going to be, even though they seem pretty different, there is going to be some similarities in terms of their contribution to homeostasis. We'll find that some of these share a commonality in terms of dealing with bodily fluids and helping to regulate them. Some of them have a common function in terms of contributing to pH balance in the body. Some of them also have a kind of shared structure as they are comprised of a number of tubes. And so we'll see a little bit of carryover from cardiovascular system in a variety of ways. We know cardiovascular is going to work very closely with the respiratory system in terms of the exchange and the transport of gases. So luckily, things that we learned in cardiovascular system previously, some of those things are going to apply here. So that's a good thing, gives us a good lead-in. In terms of immune system, we'll find that there is certainly some overlap with cardiovascular system, both in terms of them being a series of vessels that are transporting fluids from the tissues, but then also we'll find that there are some shared functions and cells between the cardiovascular system and the immune system. If you remember when we were doing cardiovascular system, we were doing blood way back when we were looking at the different types of white blood cells, we got the lymphocytes, and we were basically saying that they provided us with immunity, but we didn't go into too much detail past that. So we're going to pick that up with the immune system and talk specifically, no pun intended, about how, you'll find that funny later maybe, about how the B and T lymphocytes work to protect you as well as other different types of cells. And when we get to urinary system is also going to have some overlap. Urinary system, one of its main functions is to control the volume and composition of our extracellular fluids, specifically our blood. And so we're going to see some very close relationships there. We're going to find that in the kidney, it's going to be, despite it looking very solid, it's going to be made up of a lot of small tubes called tubules. And so with respiratory system, with immune system, with the urinary system, it's all about a series of tubes like the cardiovascular system where we are transporting substances. Now in most cases it's going to be fluid. In some cases it's going to be air, right, with the respiratory system. But we'll find that overall physics kind of parallel where we have big tubes and it's easier for things to flow through. We have small tubes and that makes it a little bit tougher. We have more resistance in our small tubes and things like that. We can change the size of the tubes and it affects the flow through them. So some of those things that we learned before are going to help us and carry us onward in these systems coming up. Okay? Okay. So in terms of lab as we're going through, lab is going to be physio-X exercises overlapping very well with some of these systems. We've got one on respiratory system, one on urinary system, and one on acid-base balance that kind of brings some of those shared functions together. So no big surprises there. So before we get started in terms of an overview for important topics for respiratory system, does anybody have any questions or things that we need to address before we move on? Silence out there is a no. Ted says he's good. Well, let me ask you this. How did exam 3 seem to you guys? How do you think it went? Seemed easier? That's always a good start. Felt it went well, like that? Like the sound of that? That's good. I mean, sometimes people have a little bit of a shock, if you will, in terms of just a change in the format, because you guys are used to being able to, kind of be at home and have your own schedule and things like that. And even though it's the same format where we saw multiple choice questions and lab questions and short answer questions, sometimes just that physical change can be a little bit, if you will, jarring. So I'm glad to hear that it didn't seem to be too much of an issue. David says multiple choice get confusing. Choice D on the exams where it says all of the above or something like that can be confusing. Yeah, I mean, pros and cons to different question types. A lot of the multiple choice questions can get into more of the details about seeing kind of how well you really know it. There's usually, an answer that's way off and you're like, oh, that one's totally not right. There's one that's a little bit closer. If you know a little bit better, you know that one's not right. And then it's a question you get down to a couple of them and you're like, well, that I'm not quite sure. Both of them seem familiar. So the question is, are they both correct? Do they both contribute in some way? Or is it just that, if you really understood how it worked, then you would know that one was more correct than the other. So it's true, those do get a little bit more detail-oriented. That's why we try to offset those with our short answer questions or essay questions, where you have, kind of freedom of expression in how you describe what you've learned about a particular topic. And that way we can get, pretty different answers to the same question, and they can both still be right. So hopefully they didn't get too confusing that way, but we shall see. And again, I'll keep you guys apprised of the process there when we get them moving forward with it. And Ted says there was one on the quiz that was also on the exam about the ECG. On the QRS portion of the wave that I got wrong on the quiz. And so did you then correct it on the exam, or? Yeah. Well, that's a good thing. See, that's to a certain extent. You can't always count on the questions from the quiz being on the exam, but sometimes they are, and doing that review is going to be better. And then sometimes even it just helps you to review that particular topic. So I'll take a look at it. Usually in terms of that, the ECG, particularly with that one, because I think I remember that one, with the B and the C, they have these kind of ranges. Rather than just pointing to the entire wave, it has a range. It says this part of the wave is, which one has to do more with, I think, ventricular depolarization or something like that. And with that one, it's not one that I necessarily came up with my own. It was kind of one that came out of their test bank associated with the textbook. But if you looked at B rather than C, the range of area for B actually covered part of the P wave as well. So it started from like the apex of the P wave, and then it went through the first part of the QRS wave complex. And the second one just had QRS wave complex to it. So that was, as I was looking through them in detail, I was kind of reasoning it out on my own in terms of answers there. So yeah, it's true. So anyway, yeah, definitely if you have a question, definitely when you get them back, go through them, check over your answers, see what you got wrong. If you have questions about it, I'm always available to kind of look at it a second time, reevaluate it. You can tell me what your thoughts are, why you think it was right, based on the reading or whatever, kind of evidence you have. So I'm always available for that. Okay, well, let us look at respiratory system. Now, of our systems of the body, I would say that respiratory system is one of the, I don't want to get too excited here, but I would say one of the simplest. It's simpler anatomically. To a certain extent, it's simpler physiologically as well. And so put that together, and it's comparatively simple. Now, it's not to say it's totally easy, but I think it's not quite as complex as things like nervous system or something like that. Okay? So, you know, on a very broad scale, the respiratory system is simplistic because, you know, it's contained within a very confined area. So we're, you know, we're superior to the diaphragm, inferior to the paranasal sinuses. This is the area where we're going to find respiratory system. That's it. So rather than, you know, like nervous system that's all over the place and muscular system that's all over the place, it's fairly confined. It also is pretty simplistic in terms of the structures that contribute to it. When we get to the digestive system, there's going to be all these different organs that each have a different function and how they contribute to digestion. Respiratory system, it's a little bit like cardiovascular, right? Series of tubes that are leading down to an area where we are going to have exchange. But these larger tubes, like the larger blood vessels, they're going to be so big, they're going to be so thick that they're just about getting, in this case, air rather than fluid, from point A to point B. And it's not until we get down into the actual lung structure where we get to the smallest and most delicate structures where we're going to allow exchange to occur. Same thing we saw in cardiovascular system, right? There it was the capillaries. Here, they're going to be structures that are called alveoli, okay? But the alveoli and the capillaries, pulmonary capillaries, are going to be right next to one another because the same thin-walled structure to a capillary is also what we see in an alveolus, which is an individual alveoli we call alveolus. And so those things together are going to give us very thin walls to allow us to exchange these respiratory gases. So if we take a look at it, something like this, you know, we're getting down into the finer structures of the lung. So trachea is one big tube, and then we're going down, down, and down, and down. And you can see the numbers changing, right? We're almost going exponentially in terms of the number of branches. Same thing that we saw in cardiovascular system, right? We needed tons of capillaries, very small, very thin, so that we can supply all the different cells in the body. And so here we have very small, very numerous structures that are these what are called bronchioles, and then alveolar ducts, and then finally getting down to alveolar sacs. An alveolar sac is going to be like this whole thing, like a bunch of grapes, and an individual alveolus is going to be like one of these different grapes in here. Okay? These are bubble-like structures, and you can see that these bubble-like structures, these alveoli, are wrapped by capillary beds. So this is going to be the area where we have such a large amount of surface area that we can do a large amount of exchange with these capillaries. So the first thing that we see in terms of the system is we're looking at the anatomy of it, right? And we can see, again, kind of in this chart, we can see along the side here we have what's called the conducting zone. That's much like the large arteries and veins where it's just about getting point A and point B. And then we have a respiratory zone. And the respiratory zone is where it's actually possible. These structures are small enough that it's possible for gas exchange to occur. Right? So when we talk about respiration, we'll talk about these different functions for the respiratory system. You're going to talk about what's called ventilation, and ventilation by definition is where we're moving air into and out of the lungs. Now, for most people, right, that don't know a lot about anatomy and physiology, that's right, unlike you guys, they think, oh, okay, well that's the whole respiratory system, right? Just air goes in and out of the lungs and then you're done. They don't know how it happens, and they think that's the only process. Now that's one of technically 4 different processes that are going to be involved. So it's very critical that we get air to move into and out of the lungs, and we need to know how that works. But the other critical processes are going to be respiration, or basically gas exchange. So we need what's called external respiration to occur between the alveoli, like we see here, and the capillaries. Now the alveoli are basically where we have gas from outside, right? This is exchanged with the external environment. And so this is where we're exchanging gases with the blood, and it's exchanging with the external environment. And so this is called external respiration. We're also going to have another process which occurs down at the tissue level, which is called internal respiration. This is where, right, the cells themselves are using oxygen in aerobic respiration, right? They're producing carbon dioxide, and those gases are exchanging with the cardiovascular capillaries. That's internal respiration, that gas exchange down within the tissues. Now, between external and internal, we've got gas transport, right? If we just had gas exchange here where the respiratory structures were, then you see this highlighted body right here? That's about all the bigger our body could be. Because if we got further away than that, our tissues would starve because they would need to be, all of our living cells would need to be right next to the lungs so that they could get the oxygen and get rid of their carbon dioxide by diffusion. But luckily we have the cardiovascular system that transports those gases around. Okay, so the gas transport, which is really a function of the cardiovascular system, is another critical aspect of the respiratory function. So we need to get air into and out of the lungs. That's only step one. Then we need to get it across the membrane, the respiratory membrane, and get it into and out of the capillaries. Capillaries and the blood vessels are going to transport it around to where it needs to go. And then we need to be able to exchange again with the cells. So we're starting out with some basic anatomy, starting out with macroscopic and then getting down to microscopic as well. So here we can see those alveoli. So an individual one is called an alveolus, and each of these little things here represents capillaries, right? We said the capillaries are going to be the sites of exchange, very thin-walled structures. And if you look at what's called the respiratory membrane, the respiratory membrane is like right here. So you can see it's made up of simple squamous epithelium from the alveolus, a fused basement membrane in the middle, and then the simple squamous epithelium of the capillary. So it's extremely thin, which facilitates the exchange of these gases. Okay, then we talk a little bit about membranes and things like that, and then here is what we were talking about in terms of the steps associated with the respiratory system. Okay, so those are 5 critical points. Now the fifth one, right? The fifth one was something that we talked about in the early chapters, something that you talked about in your general biology, so we're not really going to address the fifth one. But each of these other ones you need to know, right? So those are the major things to focus upon when you're understanding this chapter. Like when we were doing skeletal muscle or the muscular system, right? You really need to know sliding filament mechanism because that's how the whole system works. Now there were some other things too, like how the different cells get their ATP and the different types of fibers and things like that. Here, we're focusing on these 4 major topics. So you need to understand ventilation. How do we exchange these, how do we get air to go into and out of the lungs? We need to understand exchange. Now, with the exchange, with the external and the internal respiration, the movement of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide is basically going to be the same. You know, you may have one gas going one way and one the other way, but the mechanisms are the same. And so once you understand exchange between a capillary and some other substance, you're good to go for internal and external respiration. The last part, though, step 3 here, is transport. Now, we addressed that a bit in cardiovascular system. We're going to come back to it here. How is oxygen transported in the blood? How is carbon dioxide transported in the blood? How does that affect pH? What other things can affect their transport, etc.? Okay. So, for those 4 topics, I'm going to just kind of, again, hit the highlights for them. Now, you know the main topics that you're going to focus on, but we're just going to kind of hit the highlights again. So, ventilation, we get a little bit into the physics of it. So, talking about resistance and flow and things like that. But this is also very critical. Boyle's law here. This relationship between pressure and volume. Because what we will find is in order to get the air to move into and out of the lungs, we actually utilize a number of skeletal muscles. The diaphragm, the external intercostals, the scalenes, and things like that. Now, when we contract these muscles, those muscles, unlike when we were talking about skeletal muscles back in the skeletal muscle or the muscle chapter, those muscles don't have a tendinous connection to the lungs, right? So when we move the diaphragm, which is that umbrella-shaped muscle underneath the lungs, or when we contract the external intercostal muscles, which occur between the ribs, right? That's the the muscles that you're chewing on when you're eating at Tony Roma's, right? External and internal intercostal meat. Anyway, make you guys think about that for a while. Anyway, when those contract, right, what you're doing is you're moving the rib cage, or you're changing the volume of the pleural cavity. They don't have a direct connection to the lung. You're not pulling the surface of the lung directly with that muscle attached to it. What you're doing is the movement of those muscles changes the volume of the cavity. It makes that cavity get bigger or smaller. And as the volume changes, that, according to this law, also changes the pressure. So you find in the lecture, in the recorded lecture, I have kind of different examples for that. But that's one of the main things you need to understand is this relationship between pressure and volume, because that's the key way that ventilation works. We change the volume of the cavity, and the pressure then changes accordingly. Now, the other part of ventilation that's critical to know is 3 major pressures are involved. Okay? One of them is going to be atmospheric pressure. The other ones are going to be intra-alveolar pressure, right? The alveoli are all those little bubbles of the lungs. So we're saying, what's the pressure of the air inside of those? The last one is going to be called intrapleural pressure. So intra, remember, means within, and pleural is talking about the cavity that the lungs sit within. So there's a small space that exists between the surface of the lung and the wall of the cavity. And so we need to know about the pressure in there. Now when we start talking about it, what we said is, if we change the volume of the cavity, we change the pressure. And if we're changing the volume of the cavity, i.e. inside the lungs, that changes the pressure inside the lungs or inside the alveoli. And when we have a gradient where it's high pressure in one area and it's low pressure in another area, the air, the oxygen molecules and nitrogen molecules and all that type of thing, will move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Very similar to what we saw before in terms of diffusion. And so what we're going to see is we change the volume of the cavity and change the volume of the lungs. That changes the pressure inside of it, and it sets up a gradient. It's all relative to the pressure outside, the atmospheric pressure, and whether it's higher or lower than the pressure in the lungs. If the pressure in the lungs is lower than the pressure outside, then the gradient will cause the air to move into the lungs. If it's high pressure inside the lungs relative to outside in the atmosphere, then we're going to have the oxygen molecules, carbon dioxide molecules, etc., move the opposite way, again, from high to low. Okay, so you need to know those 3 pressures. You need to know their role in the body, how it relates to ventilation. Okay, then there's a bunch of information that has to do with how easy it is to inflate the lungs and the resistance, like we said, the physical nature of it, and what happens when those tubes get smaller or bigger. There's a small aside in terms of assessing respiratory function, much like we talked about assessing cardiac function, like with the ECG and listening to heart sounds and stuff like that. We have the spirometer, which measures different lung volumes and the rate at which you can exchange that volume of air. And then the next topic, like we said, the next major topic is exchange. So how do we get, once we get air into the alveoli, into the lungs, how do we get it to go into and out of the capillaries? And on the other side of the coin, how do we get the air to go, and oxygen or carbon dioxide, to go into or out of the tissues in the capillaries down there? That's critical. You know, when we learned about hemoglobin before, for instance, in the red blood cells, you know, we talked about how it can hold on to oxygen. But remember, I think at the time, we also said, it's not just about holding it. It's about being able to pick it up and bind it when necessary, but then also release it and deliver it when necessary too. Kind of like the Postal Service, right? If your postman or postwoman is delivering mail but not picking it up, it's only doing half its job. Or if it has the mail in their hand and they don't deliver it, then it's still not doing its job. Same thing with the gases. If we have them in the blood, we've got to be able to get them to and from the tissues. Now, one of the major things that drives the exchange of our important respiratory gases, those respiratory gases being oxygen and carbon dioxide, is this thing that's called partial pressure. Now, when we were talking before, when we were talking about atmospheric pressure and intraalveolar pressure, we were talking about total pressure. But in fact, you probably have an idea that the air that we breathe is a mixed gas. In fact, it's mostly nitrogen. Nitrogen which we don't utilize, but it's a mixed gas. So that means it's mixed from a bunch of different parts, a bunch of different specific gases, like oxygen gas and nitrogen gas and carbon dioxide and things like that. So those different parts that make up the whole contribute themselves to the total pressure. And so, you know, most of the pressure, like atmospheric pressure, comes from nitrogen, like 79% of it. About 21% of it actually comes from that proportion of it that's made up by oxygen. And then carbon dioxide is relatively small comparatively. Okay? So partial pressures are really, to a certain extent, like concentration. It's telling you how much of that particular molecule is found in that volume of air. Okay? And if we look at it as concentration, the same way we were talking about total pressure differences causing movement from high to low, same thing can take place in terms of partial pressures. Wherever we have a relatively high concentration of one gas, so PO2 there is partial pressure of oxygen. If it's high over here and it's relatively low over here, we've got a nice gradient which sends it from high to low. Luckily, carbon dioxide works the other way, right? Relatively high here in this venous blood, relatively low here in the alveoli. And so we get movement going the other way for carbon dioxide. Same thing happens down here. Okay? So you need to understand partial pressures because that's very important in terms of gas exchange. So from exchange, then we move to transport. And with transport, like we said, we kind of go back to what we had seen before in terms of respiratory, or in terms of cardiovascular system, and we remind ourselves about the major ways that oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported. So of course most of the oxygen is transported attached to the hemoglobin molecule of red blood cells, and like we said, it's very critical that the hemoglobin molecule can hold on to or bind oxygen when necessary, like when there's a lot of it around, and it needs to be able to give it up appropriately when there's a demand for it. Okay, so just like, you know, the Postal Service. So here we see what's called a hemoglobin saturation curve. It's also sometimes called a hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve, because saturation means that we're looking at packing up the hemoglobin with oxygen. Dissociation, if you look at it the other way, is how can we get oxygen to peel off of it when necessary. Now you'll remember hemoglobin has 4 different binding pockets that contain that iron-containing heme group. And so when we look at this graph, what we're seeing here is partial pressure of oxygen. We can kind of think of that as concentration. And on the y-axis we have hemoglobin saturation. So when we have a lot of oxygen, high partial pressure, we're going to see that the hemoglobin is basically 100% saturated. Okay, so this is like the arteries. Now, as we get transported down to the tissues, we're going to see the surrounding tissue concentration or partial pressure of oxygen drop off because the cells are using that oxygen to produce ATP, etc. So you can see we kind of go from 100%, we go down to about 75% here. Okay, 75%, right? If you go from 4 down to 3, if we only have 3 out of 4 oxygen molecules in hemoglobin, now we're at 3/4, which equals 75%. Now this is overall, right? We're not talking about one molecule, but you can see where we go from 4 down to 3, down to 2, and stuff like that. So commonly, down at the tissue levels, we actually give up, the hemoglobin will give up like 1 of its 4 oxygens or something. But if there's more of a need, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is continuing to go down, more of this oxygen will peel off of the hemoglobin and will be donated to the tissues. So that's why we see, this is saturation, right? We see the saturation going down because we're giving up more oxygen to the tissues. Okay, so this just shows, right, oxygen bound to hemoglobin, it will actually then dissolve into the plasma, go into the interstitial fluid, and get to the cells, specifically like to the mitochondria, which can use them. This series of graphs here are also saturation or dissociation curves, And what these are showing you are kind of interesting. They're showing you, we already saw that the concentration of oxygen in the surrounding tissues, etc., will cause more oxygen to be released from hemoglobin, dissociate from hemoglobin, right? So if the cells are really active, right? So if you think of skeletal muscle cells and they're using a lot of oxygen because they're utilizing and making a lot of ATP, then the surrounding tissue, as the blood gets there from the capillary, if you will, it's kind of looking around and going, wow, you guys are really oxygen deficient around here. I'm not only going to give you 1 oxygen, I'm going to drop off 2 to you because it looks like you need it, okay? So the concentration of oxygen or partial pressure is going to be a key factor in hemoglobin, either releasing oxygen like at the tissues or picking it up like at the lungs. But there's a number of other factors or conditions that will also affect the saturation or the dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin. So if we look at things like temperature, if we look at acidity, if you look at the concentration of certain metabolites and things like that, those things will also be indicators of whether that particular tissue is more active or not. And so what we usually see is if there's an indicator that says it's more active, like it's warming up or it's becoming more acidic or something like that, we see this association curve drop. And that means at a given concentration of oxygen, we find that it's actually going to drop more oxygen from the hemoglobin at that concentration compared to if that tissue was less active. So for a given concentration of oxygen, if you combine it with, hey, it's very acidic around here and it's warm around here, all of those factors are stimulating hemoglobin to release oxygen to that tissue because they're all indicating that that tissue is very active. So if you see a drop, if you will, in the dissociation curve like that, you see it go down, that means that the hemoglobin is giving off more oxygen to that active tissue. Okay? So then carbon dioxide, we look at the other side of the coin. Carbon dioxide is mostly transported in the blood as bicarbonate ion in the plasma. Now the interesting thing about that is that the chemical reaction that changes carbon dioxide gas into bicarbonate, which is what you see right here, this chemical reaction, occurs because of an enzyme that's called carbonic anhydrase, right? It's got the ASE on the end. Notice that the carbonic anhydrase occurs inside of the red blood cells. So even though carbon dioxide is mainly transported in the plasma, the reaction that makes it possible is within the erythrocytes. Okay? Okay. So that's kind of one of our last major topics, is talking about transport of these respiratory gases. Now we would be remiss in not looking at how this system is coordinated and controlled with other systems by the nervous system, right? So we always have to look at like neural and or hormonal control about how we control the system, how we make it match its activity with our bodily needs in order to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so that's the last major topic here, is that we get into, okay, what areas of the brain are involved, what are their actions, and how do they control the respiratory function. Now for this, if you'll remember when we were talking about nervous system, the lower we went down in the brain, right, we went from cerebrum down to diencephalon down to cerebellum and brainstem. Lower we got in the brain, more inferior we went, the more basic life functions we saw. Okay, so we're going to find that the main control centers for a respiratory system are in the pons and the medulla of the brainstem, and you can look into the details about that. Now again, in terms of these control areas, being able to accurately tune the output of the system, as with any negative feedback, we've got to have receptors that send us information about what's going on now. We've got to have a set point about where it's supposed to be, and we've got to have a control center that kind of compares those, and then if we need to make changes, it's got efferent neural pathways to produce an effect, right? In this case, we might change the depth that we're breathing, we might change the breathing rate, and things like that. Okay, so we're just seeing different types of receptors, pressure receptors, mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, and things like that that are going to feed back to the control center and tell it what's going on. Last couple topics, sleep apnea, hypoxia, and things like that. They're important. Yeah, I mean, you should definitely learn about them, but they're kind of secondary, right? It's not the primary importance. We want to know how this system works, how it does its job. And those are the major topics we were talking about before instead. Okay, so as I mentioned, the respiratory system is fairly simple compared to some of our other systems. Fairly simple anatomically, fairly simple physiologically as well. So any questions on that? David's typing. We'll see what he has to say. And Carrie's typing. Okay. Okay, so two things there. And again, you know, I'm kind of expecting, now granted, you guys just came off of an exam. So usually when we do the discussion sections, I've kind of assumed that you've gotten into the chapter a little bit. And so I don't go into the vast amount of detail in terms of the explanations because you have the recorded archives for that. But at the same time, if you haven't had a chance, we don't want to confuse you either. So let's address both of these where we can kind of clear things up. Okay? So partial pressure. See if we can get to that. So partial pressure, like we said, is going to be where we have a mixed gas, and when we have a mixed gas, it's going to be made up of a number of different individual gases. So the air that we breathe is going to be nitrogen plus oxygen plus carbon dioxide. Okay? Let me actually put a new page in here. So nitrogen gas, plus oxygen gas plus carbon dioxide. Okay? That is, for the most part, there's going to be some carbon monoxide in there and stuff like that, but these three gases comprise, for the most part, what we call air. Okay? Now, in terms of the relative percentages of that, what we find is that it's dominated by nitrogen. So the air that we breathe is about 79% nitrogen. It's about 20 or 21%, if you will, oxygen, and it's a relatively small amount of carbon dioxide, right? You do the math there, and you're talking about less than 1% of carbon dioxide, okay? Okay, so if you add that up, that equals 100. So commonly, atmospheric pressure, or the pressure of the air in the atmosphere, is going to be equal to, let me kind of set this up again, I want to get about the same type. It's going to be equal to about 760 millimeters of mercury, or 1 atmosphere. Okay? That's the total. And so this is like if you're looking at the barometer or something like that, and you're saying high pressure system, low pressure system, things like that. This is the pressure, about air pressure. Now, atmospheric pressure is going to vary based on weather patterns and things like that, but we kind of take it as a constant of about 1 atmosphere, or 760 millimeters of mercury. That's how they used to measure it. So that's the whole, that's the sum. This is kind of like some of the math questions that some of my kids are doing too. So you're looking at the sum of these different parts to make the whole. So if the whole, or the total, is 760, and we're trying to figure out, okay, how much does nitrogen contribute then to that 760? How much does oxygen contribute to that 760, that whole? So you can multiply 21% times 160, and you would actually get things like some of the numbers that we were seeing here. Okay? So in the atmosphere, 21% of 760 is about 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay? So like we were saying, that's kind of the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere there. And so that's a relatively high concentration. You breathe, you ventilate the lungs, you're expecting, oh, that's where I'm going to get my new shipment of air from, right? So that's where our highest concentration is going to be. And so when we look at these partial pressures, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the pressure from an individual gas. So we're really not concerned with nitrogen. We're really looking at the concentration, or the partial pressure of oxygen. So what's the concentration of oxygen in one area compared to another area, like in the blood? Same thing, what's the partial pressure of carbon dioxide by itself compared to in the blood? Okay? And if you look at it, as long as we have a gradient, then what we're going to have is we'll have movement from one area to another. So here in arterial blood we see it to be 100, venous blood is down at 40 for oxygen, right? In the alveoli, it's going to be relatively high concentration. You've inhaled this fresh volume of air. And so we're going to see that in an area where we have a high concentration, ooh, I just went crazy with my line there. In an area where we have high concentration, in an area where we have low concentration, we're going to have oxygen moving from high to low. If we look at the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is relatively high in the blood, in the venous blood. It's relatively low in this freshly oxygenated air. So here, we're going to have carbon dioxide moving from high to low. It's going to be moving the other way. So that's what we're seeing when we're seeing all these P's all around here. We're looking at the specific concentration of one of those gases in a particular area, comparing two areas. Is it high? Where is it high? Where is it low? So where is it going to be moving from and going to? Does that help a little bit more in terms of partial pressure? Now, in terms of Carrie's question, Postal Service is talking, my analogy, for the hemoglobin molecule. So when we were talking about cardiovascular system itself, we said that the hemoglobin molecule can be like the individual mailman or mailwoman, right? He or she needs to pick up the mail at some point. Now here what we're seeing is they're going to pick up something like oxygen from the alveoli. That's where we're going to get the oxygen. So this is like the main post office or something like that, the distribution center. Then, right, the mail truck needs to get on the freeway maybe and take it to your particular town or your area of town. Then he has to get off on side streets, get into your neighborhood, slow down, and then go to your individual houses and make deliveries. So we see there's big pathways that go really fast. We're not making stops. We're not making deliveries. We're just going from point A to point B. When we get into the neighborhoods, that's when we're slowing down. We're making stops. And the second part about that is that we are doing an exchange there, right? If the postman came to your neighborhood and he delivered your mail, but he didn't pick it up, he'd only be doing half his job. Same thing in terms of the hemoglobin molecule, right? When we get down to the smaller structures, like the alveolar ducts and the alveoli and the capillaries, this is where we're going to start to make exchanges. And the hemoglobin molecule needs to be able to drop off oxygen, like to the tissues, and then the blood is going to, need to pick up carbon dioxide from the cells and from the tissues as well. So it needs to be able to do that exchange, dropping off a particular gas, picking up something while it's there as well. So is that a bit better? Okay. Other questions? Okay, well that was the major thing that I was looking to address tonight. Now do keep in mind as we're moving forward, right? We said we had 3 chapters coming up. Respiratory system, urinary system, and the last one being, respiratory system, immune system, and then the urinary system. Now of the 3 systems that we are addressing, respiratory system is the easiest. Immune system and urinary system are a bit more complex, okay? So budget your time wisely. Get your jump on respiratory system now, and if you can, get into immune system a little bit earlier. Definitely by next Thursday, you should definitely be into immune system, so that when I'm going over it, we're trying to cement those major topics. We're answering questions that you may have, etc. Same thing with the urinary system, because when we meet on the first week of November, we want to make sure that we're addressing your questions in that one too, because the very next week, right, November 13th, is our exam over all 3 of those. So we want to make sure that we're ready for that. Okay? All right. Like usual, I'll hang out in case any other questions come up. Otherwise, next time you hear from me will be me letting you know that the exams have arrived here physically, and then keeping you up to date in terms of grading and posting. Okay? Quiz time. Excellent question. So for quizzes, in terms of our schedule, I would rather, we usually have 2 quizzes, right? We have 2 quizzes before we get to the exam. I would like to have the first quiz include respiratory system and immune system, and then the last quiz only include urinary system. So we're talking, in order to make that happen, we'll probably have our first quiz, not this weekend, but the following weekend. And then we'll have the second quiz be only over urinary system, and that will be the weekend before the exam itself. Alrighty. Well, other than that, we will talk to you guys again soon.